This project was developed and supported by SAS Barley. Participating agri-arm sites include Outlook, Melfort, Prince Albert, Scott, Swift Current, Indian Head, and we here at Yorkton are leading the project. We've been leading barley projects for a number of years now, and this project evaluates many of the principles we've investigated in the past. It's a large trial with 24 treatments, but before we cover the results of this trial, let's give you a little history to what we've observed in the past. Much of the results we'll be discussing today are supported by either SAS Barley, Adopt, or both. One of the first questions I wanted to answer was, do newer malt barley varieties require more nitrogen? We compared the old variety Metcalf against newer varieties Bow and Synergy. Metcalf is generally 15% lower yielding than Synergy, and I suspect that the optimum rate of nitrogen for Synergy would be higher. Applying too much N to barley can cause rejection for malt due to excessive protein. In general, protein above 12.5% may result in rejection for malt. We found Metcalf would reach 12.5% protein at a lower rate of nitrogen than Synergy, which gave us the opportunity to push Synergy yields further with higher rates of nitrogen. Depending upon the economic scenario, the optimum rate of nitrogen was 10 to 20 pounds per acre higher for Synergy. So then we decided to see if levels of other inputs should vary between the same varieties of Synergy, Bow, and Metcalf. We looked at varying levels of seeding rate, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, plant growth regulator, and fungicide at either the flag or early heading stages. We had 15 site years of data, and I decided to group them into high and low yielding groups, as I surmised the high yielding group would be more responsive to added inputs. There were 9 site years in the high yielding group and 6 in the low yielding group. Statistically, there wasn't a difference in the response to inputs between the varieties, although Metcalf did appear less responsive to nitrogen as expected. The low yielding site years did not respond positively to any additional input. In other words, the least amount of input was the most economical. That's what happens when drought is the cause of the reduced yield potential. The application of PGR on the low-yielding droughted sites reduced the yield potential by about 10%, increased thins, and delayed maturity by a day. Not a big surprise. We have seen a 25% yield increase in our wheat work from spraying PGR. Spraying PGR during a drought is not a worthwhile practice. In our study, high-yielding barley sites responded to increased fertility, and some modest responses to fungicides were also observed. However, there were no yield responses to PGR or seed treatment, as seedling disease and lodging have been low in recent years. In our enhanced barley variety trials, we moved to test a wider range of malt and feed barley varieties and dropped Metcalf, as it was a variety in decline. The malt varieties were Synergy, Connect, and Fraser. The feed varieties were Ossison, Claymore, and Oriana. These varieties were evaluated at standard versus enhanced rates of nitrogen. For our location, this was 130 versus 162 pounds of nitrogen per acre of soil plus added nitrogen. The surprise for me was that there was no evidence to suggest feed should receive more nitrogen than malt. If you look at the crop planning guide and soil test recommendations of nitrogen for malt versus feed, they're always higher for the feed. Our work with newer varieties of malt and feed barley varieties doesn't really support this practice. Usually the most economic rate of nitrogen for newer varieties was often achieved before 12.5% protein was exceeded, and barley would be rejected for malt. If the nitrogen response curve for malt and feed is the same, and feed is worth less, then the most economic rate of nitrogen for feed will be lower. Now, there are other things to consider. There is no financial penalty for over-fertilizing your feed barley with nitrogen like there is with malt barley. So the fear of malt rejection due to excessive protein is a valid reason for applying less nitrogen to malt barley. However, I suspect some of the end recommendation differences between malt and feed is based on old data, when the yield potential of malt barley was considerably less than feed. and this is no longer the case with newer varieties. But in the end, I'm not going to try to convince anyone to apply more nitrogen than you usually do to your malt barley. But I will suggest that if you are growing a new malt barley variety like Synergy, and it's coming in around 12% protein, it likely wasn't economical to fertilize your feed barley with more nitrogen than you supplied to the malt, all things being equal. We have also looked at these varieties with and without fungicide. As you know, disease pressures haven't been high as of late. But we did find that Claymore and Oriana frequently had more leaf disease, and the application of fungicide was more beneficial for these varieties in terms of disease control, yield, and lodging. We also haven't had a lot of lodging lately, and PGR applied during the drought wasn't beneficial, often decreasing seed weights, test weights, and percent plumps. There was some lodging at Outlook under irrigation, and the PGR did decrease lodging and increase yield for Ossison at this location. So all of these concepts have been included into one large trial of 24 treatments. Like the enhanced barley trials of the past, we are evaluating Synergy, Connect, Fraser, Ossison, Claymore, and Oriana at enhanced nitrogen rates with and without fungicide and PGR. We were pretty dry at Yorkton, so I'm not expecting great things from the PGR or fungicide. Having said that, we did observe significantly less disease on the Oriana when sprayed with fungicide, so Oriana was still getting significant disease even in a drier year at our location. But let's go into the future and see what happened at all locations. Well, it turned out that many of the sites were relatively dry, like Yorkton, except for ICDC, which was under irrigation, and Swift Current, which received 95% of their average rainfall. Unfortunately, some of that precipitation came in the form of hail, which greatly reduced the yield of the barley. From this figure, you can see fungicide in blue versus no fungicide in yellow did not significantly increase yield at any of the locations. For the most part, fungicide didn't affect grain protein either. However, there was an interaction at Yorkton which found the grain protein for Synergy was significantly reduced by fungicide, implying the yield may have been increased by fungicide. However, this wasn't supported by the yield data. While levels of leaf disease were very low in this study, fungicide managed to reduce leaf disease, but only for the variety Oriana. Oriana is in green, and you can see on the right the higher level of leaf disease Oriana had relative to the other varieties when untreated. When sprayed with the fungicide Trivapro, the level of leaf disease was significantly reduced for Oriana in green. The same phenomena occurred at Yorkton, Scott, and Swift Current. At Swift Current, there was also a trend for the leaf disease to be reduced by fungicide for Claymore. Both Claymore and Oriana are susceptible to netted net blotch, whereas the other varieties are more resistant. However, even when untreated, the level of leaf disease was still low for Oriana, and the application of fungicide did not result in a yield increase. PGR also didn't affect yield at most sites, as lodging was not an issue. The exception occurred at Swift Current, where PGR actually increased yield. One might assume PGR may have helped with the standability after the hail event. However, this hypothesis was not supported by the lodging ratings. PGR did reduce the height of barley, but it seemed to be more effective on the malt barley varieties in this study than the feed barley varieties. At Indian Head, the height of the malt barley varieties Synergy, Connect, and Fraser were significantly reduced by the PGR modus. However, the heights of the feed barley varieties, Ossison, Claymore, and Oriana were not significantly reduced. At Yorkton, malt barley varieties were once again significantly reduced by PGR, but the feed varieties were not. This same pattern also emerged at Melfort if we cheat a bit and use the less conservative LSD to separate means instead of the Tukey's test. Malt barley varieties significantly reduced. Feed barley varieties are not. And finally, enhancing the rate of nitrogen by 30 pounds per acre did not increase yields at most sites except Indian Head. However, an increase in yield at this site was only detected for the varieties Connect and Claymore. Enhancing nitrogen did increase grain protein at most sites, and this would be expected. So, in summary, conditions were dry, disease and lodging was low, and there wasn't much information to suggest varieties should be managed differently. Oriana is more susceptible to disease, netted net blotch, and if pressures are high, I would assume Oriana would be more likely to benefit from fungicide. I also suspect that the malt barley varieties in this study would be more likely to benefit from the application of PGR when lodging is an issue. Two reasons for this. One, PGR was often more effective at reducing the height of the malt barley varieties in this study compared to the feed. And two, the malt varieties generally had lower lodging ratings compared to the feed. Lodging resistance for the malt barley varieties, Synergy, Connect, and Fraser, were fair, good, and good, respectively, whereas the lodging ratings for the feed barley varieties, Ossison, Claymore, and Oriana, were good, and very good, respectively. Thanks to SAS Barley and Sustainable Cap for supporting this work.